Welcome back to our show. This time on this episode, we are talking about our most effective strategy for helping our students understand the natural social consequences of the choices that they make. And I think what's interesting about this strategy is I know that while we are going to be talking about it, there are going to be people who hear it and maybe think that they can't imagine implementing this strategy, or you might even feel surprised that it is successful. I think for a lot of people, it seems maybe even a little extreme, not something that you could imagine yourself doing with your child or your students. But I'll tell you, from my neurodivergent perspective, it is absolutely the best strategy. It is necessary in order for our kids to build their level of social awareness. And it's incredibly successful, not only for the kiddo that we're talking about in that situation, in that moment, but also for all the other students who are in the group at that time to be able to witness us using this strategy. So that's what we're talking about today. We have 3 specific examples. Plus the notebook. We've got several specific examples. And then we may even think of more as we go. Because if you haven't figured it out, Ramiro and I just ad-lib this whole thing. We just sit here. We're basically just having conversations with each other.
Yeah, there's no
that's why it's called unscripted,
Yes.
right? So usually things will come up as we're talking, and we'll just remember other situations and scenarios. So here we go. So this mystery strategy has a couple different components to it. One component is that we are very black and white with the way that we communicate with our students. And I know that's a pretty well-known concept about neurodivergent brains, that we tend to think in black and white, but it also means we need people to talk to us in black and white. Neurotypical communication tends to not be very black and white. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of
reading between the lines.
Yeah, reading between the lines. A lot of associations. Even if you think about if you want your kiddo to come to the table for dinner, is that what you say? Or do you say something like, it's time for dinner? If you're trying to get out the door, do you say, we need to grab our shoes and put them on so that we can get in the van and be ready to go? Or do you say something like, I don't want to be late? So even situations like that, it's indirect communication, and our students function best with direct communication. I'm going to break in here and just give some personal examples for me. As I've talked about before, I am in and out of online dating. Sometimes I'm in, sometimes I'm out. It's a whole process. Currently, I am in. And what I've realized about me is I need someone to be very direct with me about whether they're interested in me or not. If we have a first date, I need them to explicitly tell me whether they're interested in a second date. If they're not feeling it anymore, I need them to explicitly tell me. I'm very intuitive when it comes to what people think and how they feel, except for when it comes to what they think and how they feel about me. And that goes for everybody. I'm on the board of a nonprofit. And I remember when I went to my interview for the board, a friend of mine said, oh, how do you think it went? And I remember saying, I have no idea. I am very clueless when it comes to what other people think and how they feel about me, even though I can usually tell what they think and how they feel about other people or other circumstances. So that's my personal example with dating is I need somebody to explicitly tell me what they think or how they feel. Otherwise, I do not know. And I'm trying to put pieces together and figure things out, but we're all different. We all communicate differently. And so one person's sign that they are interested could be someone else's sign that they're kind of whatever. So my point being that those of us who have more neurodivergent thinking patterns really do much better with direct, straightforward, black and white communication. Because that's not the norm, a lot of people feel uncomfortable communicating directly with our students because that's not what they prefer. Most neurotypical people don't like straightforward, direct communication. So, for example, if you think about your partner, your spouse, your boss, if somebody has something that they want to talk to you about, most neurotypical people prefer, like, what is it, like the sandwich method, where you start with a compliment and then you say what the problem is and then you end with a compliment. I don't want any of that. Just tell me what the problem is. Just tell me what it is that we need to talk about. Because of this, I'm really bad at small talk. I'm really bad at asking people how they're doing. I just want the meat of the conversation. But because most neurotypical communication is more, like, I think of it as like flowery, right? There's more indirect communication. There's more unintentional communication. If you want to have a serious conversation with somebody, there's a lot more ad-libbing. Maybe there's a lot more that you add to it to kind of make it softer. With us, we actually need the opposite. We just need the direct information so that we can process it and decide what we want to do with it. So that's the first thing in this strategy that we use with our students, is we are very direct with them. We try not to imply anything. We try not to infer. We try not to be indirect about things. We try to be very direct so that we get our point across, but also that is the quickest, easiest way for our kids to learn, is by people communicating directly about what's happening. The second part of this strategy is making very sure that our students understand that whatever they think and however they feel is always okay. It is always okay to be upset. It is always okay to feel frustrated. It is always okay to feel like someone's leaving you out. It is always okay to not want to do something or to not want to be somewhere. And we have these conversations as often as possible because it's always okay for us to think the way that we think and feel the way that we feel. It's okay to be mad. It's okay to not want to do your homework. Anything that you think and feel is okay. And we want to be mindful about the choices that we make when we think and feel that way. That's the key that we focus on, is the choices that we're making when we think and we feel that way. So those are the two components to this strategy. Is number one, very straightforward communication. And number two, being very respectful and empathetic towards the way that this person is thinking and feeling. Because even if we don't understand it, even if it doesn't make sense to us, it is how they are thinking and feeling. And that is always okay. Every single person has the right to think and feel the way that we think and feel. So those are the two components of this strategy that work together. So basically what happens is when someone has made a choice that has negatively affected their reputation in the group, we call it out. In the moment, we call it out. Sometimes we'll talk about it a couple weeks later if it's relevant to something that is in our lesson, but we call it out directly. We do not say people's names, but we very directly talk about the choices that were made. And we reiterate that it was totally okay for that person to think and feel the way that they were thinking and feeling. And then we talk about the natural social consequences of the choices that they made. So it's the two things together. So to make this more concrete, we're going to talk about a situation that happened in one of our groups a week ago. We have, we're teaching a dating course right now. So we have 8 students who are 14 and up, who they and their parents agreed that they wanted to learn about dating, ironically from me. Oh, the hypocrisy. No, but anyways, so we started when we came back from spring break with this group of kids talking about dating and relationships. We are in our relationship module with all of our students right now. With this group, we're just making it a little more mature. It is, instead of being focused on friendships, it is focused on dating and romantic relationships. A week ago, we were focusing on having reciprocal conversations with somebody that we're interested in, and how we keep those conversations going, and how we initiate conversations by thinking about something specific we know about that person. So at Starfish, we try to stay away from generic conversations with people that we know. And this applies even to friends and acquaintances. Once we know somebody, we try to stay away from things like, how are you? How was your weekend? How's it going? Basically something that you could say to anybody, we try to stay away from. We want to be specific to people that we know. So that was our task last week in our dating class, is they got to pick anybody that they wanted to in the group, and they thought about something specific they know about that person, and then they used it to initiate a conversation. And then the other person's job was to help keep the conversation going. So we talk a lot about different strategies and techniques for reciprocal conversations here at Starfish. Most of the kids in the dating course have been here for a few years. So that's what we were practicing last week. And there was one student in the group who came in with all of the physical signs of not wanting to be here, not participating in class, having her arms crossed, not looking at other people, looking down, just very disengaged. If somebody would say something to her, it was a very brief answer, and the tone of her voice was very negative.
Yeah.
Right. So very obvious that she probably did not want to be here. Again, totally fine. We talk about this all the time. There's days where Ramiro and I don't want to be here, right? Totally fine to think that way and feel that way. One of the students chose her to have a conversation with, and he started a conversation with her, and she continued to be very unresponsive, one-word answers, putting no effort into making it reciprocal. He, in the whole group, is probably one of the least socially aware kiddos. So I'm not sure that he recognized what was going on, but I could feel that all the other kids were feeling really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It was a very uncomfortable situation, and they were one of the last groups to go. So everybody else who had gone had these really beautiful conversations, and we're putting in a lot of effort, and there's just a mutual understanding amongst the kids that this is a difficult thing, and we're all working on it, and there's a lot of support for each other. And then this group went, and it was very awkward. So I basically just took the opportunity to turn it into a learning moment, which is what everything is. And so I just said, I stopped the conversation, or it naturally was something. I started to feel bad for the guy that was trying to have the conversation, because it was going nowhere. And so I stopped the conversation, and I asked the group, I said, have you guys ever tried to have a conversation with someone who does not want to talk to you? And of course, everybody can relate to that. It's not even a Starfish thing, right? It's not even an autism thing. We've all had conversations with people that just aren't that interested in talking to us. So we all were able to relate on that point. And then I talked about, what did you guys notice about that conversation that just happened? And all the kids are like, that was awkward. That was weird. She wasn't even looking at him. She wasn't even. So they started calling out what was happening. Okay. At no point am I directing the conversation toward the student at the center of this situation. At no point am I calling her out, saying her name. We're just talking about the situation. It could have been any student involved in the situation. But as a group, we started talking about how awkward that was and how we've all been in situations like that. And so then I said, is it okay to not want to talk to somebody? And of course, the kids have been here long enough that they know that at Starfish, the answer to that is yes. It is okay to not want to talk to somebody. Is it okay to, just not feel like having a conversation with somebody that you don't really get along with? Yes, it is okay to feel that way. And so then we talked about how it makes the other person feel when we act in such a way, and that it probably makes them not want to talk to us again, which may be fine, except it also makes all the people who experience that situation much less likely to want to talk to us. So there's 8 kids in that group. 2 of them were in the discussion and 6 of them were observing. So even if it's just that one person that she didn't want to talk to, all 6 of the other students were observing this. And it makes them much less likely to want to talk to her because of the way that she responded to this one student. So that's a much bigger concept, right? It's not just about this person. It's about everybody in the group has now seen how you interacted with this person, and they are probably much less likely to want to have a conversation with you next week, next month, or whatever. So at no point did I call out this particular student. We never said her name. I wasn't staring at her while I'm, having this discussion. None of the other kids said her name. None of the other kids talked about her. We just had the conversation. And then we had a couple kids who hadn't taken their turn yet, but most of them had. And so we had the kids who had already gone. They went to another room. And we're just hanging out. It was almost the end of class. And I stayed back with the 2 kids who hadn't taken their turn yet. This student happened to be one of them. So she had not initiated. She was basically just kind of refusing to. She had not initiated. Someone had initiated with her. So I stayed back with the 2 students who had not initiated. And when she took her turn, she chose me to initiate with, which was totally fine. That was one of the things that was allowed. And she and I had a great conversation. So in the span of 5 minutes, just by us being very blunt and direct about the situation and the natural social consequences, she had a completely different conversation with me 5 minutes later. The interesting thing is we had this group again yesterday, and she had a totally different attitude coming in yesterday. She's typically a pretty engaged student. She's typically, like one of the de facto leaders here. So that's how she came in yesterday. Participating, part of the group, energetic. Yesterday, we built on the conversations and we added, the goal of the conversations was for them to find things they had in common. And so again, the only criteria this time was they couldn't choose someone that they had a conversation with last week. So they had to choose somebody new. And this week it couldn't be me or Ramiro. I didn't even notice it, but she was one of the last people to go again. So most of the other students had already had their conversations and she was one of the last ones to go. She said, well, nobody even chose me today. And then she said, but I'm going to choose so-and-so. But she made a specific comment that nobody chose to have a conversation with her. And it was so interesting because it's because of what happened last week, even though that's not even her normal mode. That's what happened last week. And the kids by default remembered that and did not want that to happen to them. They did not want to be in a conversation with someone that did not want to be in a conversation with them. So it was really interesting that, number one, she had a completely different attitude when she came in this week. Number two, she noticed the social consequences of the choices that she made last week. And number three, her conversation this week was really good. She put a lot of effort into it. So she really tried to have a much different outcome this week. And because of that, I would guess that next week, more kids will choose to have a conversation with her because the kids like her. I mean, there's not anybody at Starfish that the other kids don't like, because that's, that's what we're working on, right? So there's not anybody here that kids just don't like. They like her. And I think it was just the awkwardness of last week. They don't want to be in that position with her.
Yeah.
So that's one of our situations that came up, and how we handle it by just being really direct and obvious about what happened, and then pointing out to everybody how that situation played out. I'm thinking we did it a couple weeks ago with the student who tried to sit in someone else's chair, right? We called it out in front of the whole group, not targeting him, but helping him understand the natural social consequences. And for everybody else in the group, if you decide to take a chair from someone else, this is probably how that's going to play out. But our kids are so receptive to this strategy. With the chair situation, he got a little upset, but I don't think we've ever had a student have a big reaction when we use this strategy, which logic tells you that being this direct and upfront would lead to big reactions. I don't think we've ever had a student have a big reaction when we're this direct with them, because what we're doing is helping them understand what happened and the consequences of what happened versus how other people have handled that situation. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, is there anything else you want to add to that?
I was going to say, speaking of like just that concept overall, I feel like we may have talked about this before, but there's another student who, okay, so let me rephrase. We've been talking about how if we're acquaintances with other people, if someone asks us how our day's going or how we're doing, the expected answer is always something like, "Oh, I'm good. How are you?" Or "My day's good. How are you?" Just a very typical answer that anyone would expect when they ask an acquaintance how they're doing. But yeah, the student tends to have different answers, like very more personal answers, I guess. And usually it's always something negative. Like we ask how if we do ask him how he's doing when he comes in, he always says something like, "Oh, I'm terrible," or "Oh, it was a rough day," or something like that. Like he would always go the negative route, and like he would never just use what we call the social fake and say "I'm good" or "It's fine." He would always take that negative route. And so we talk about how as acquaintances, it makes the other person feel uncomfortable if that is our answer to that question, and how we typically don't want to like complain to an acquaintance or like talk about our days or ourselves in a negative light when someone's just simply asking us how we're doing.
Versus a friend or family member, right? So just to make that distinction, that friends and family members, that's a genuine question, that's a genuine question, right? If they ask us how we're doing, that's a conversation, right? They really want to know. But with an acquaintance, it's just small talk. It's just somebody trying to be polite. And so that's a huge distinction.
Yeah. And so I noticed that like the last time he tried to do that after we had that lesson, I believe it happened with you and also me when he tried to have that little small talk conversation with us, when he would say, "Oh, it's a terrible day," or "Oh, man, it was so bad," like something that was just very very negative in that light. Me and Steph, we kind of just like stopped talking to him, and I know that when it happened with me with him, I said, that makes me feel kind of weird, like I wasn't really expecting that answer, and I don't really know what to say right now, just because I want him to try to understand that answering that way with acquaintances, it makes the other person feel uncomfortable, and it makes them not want to necessarily continue the conversation with them.
Or ask him again next time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
You're much
absolutely.
less likely to ask that person next time how they're doing if
Yeah.
that's the answer that you always get, right?
Right. Because I'm sure sometimes other people that he knows would just listen to him if he went on with that conversation, and would listen to him complain about what happened, or go into detail and stuff like that. Um, but I by me telling him how I feel when he talks to me like that, and how that makes me not want to talk to him in the future, or not continue the conversation. I'm not criticizing him. I'm not like insulting him or being mean to him or rude to him. I'm just acknowledging how his answer makes me feel, and what that feeling does, or like makes me want to react to him. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. You're teaching him the natural social consequence of that choice.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean he can't keep doing it. I
Right.
think that's the thing. Even the student, she could have come in again this week and had made the same choices. It's totally fine. I think that's a big thing with us here too, is we don't tell the kids what to do.
Mhm.
We help them understand the consequences, positive and negative,
Mhm.
of the choices that they make. So he could come in again, do the same thing, right? He could do it today, right? Come in and be like, oh, it's been a horrible day. She could have come in yesterday and made the same choice and had really awkward conversations.
Mhm.
But once they realize the social consequences of the choices they're making, they don't want those social consequences.
Mhm.
And so they'll make a different choice.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's another really good example. Is there anything else you want to say about that one?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you know what? It goes both ways. Like we teach the kids to give feedback too. There was a time where a student told me, Steph, I don't like it when you interrupt me. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I was doing that. And then I felt so bad, right? I didn't even realize I had been interrupting him. Which, if you guys listen to this podcast, I'm sure you can totally see that I probably interrupt people all the time.
No.
But I absolutely, I apologized to him. I tried to be much more aware of that. Feedback has to go both ways.
Mhm.
We owe it to our kids to give them social feedback. That's the only way they can learn and grow, is by getting feedback from people who care about them. And we owe it to them to take their feedback.
Mhm.
Right? It's got to be reciprocal. We have to be able to listen to what they say as well. So yeah, definitely has to go both ways. Okay, along the same line, we want to give an update on something that we talked about in a previous episode, when we talked about how we work with kiddos who have social anxiety and who are anxious or apprehensive about coming in. And we talked about 2 specific kids that happen to be in the same group and that have really been struggling with coming in and being part of the group. So on the last episode, we talked about some of the strategies that we've used to help make that better. Last week, both of these children came in like nothing.
Mhm.
Like they both walked in the door smiling, came into the group, had a seat, like nothing. A complete 180.
Yes.
A complete 180 for the kiddo who was struggling to even come in the first place.
Mhm.
And then for the other student who has been crying, not quite a 180, because that's been gradually getting better each
Mhm.
week. But holy cow, for Ramiro and I just like looked at each other. Oh my gosh. Both of these kids just came in like they've been here for years. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
With the girl, 2 weeks ago, when I opened the door to let the students in, she was already like hugging her
clinging.
mom. Yeah,
Yeah.
like I couldn't see her face, but when she would pull away, I would see that she was crying. This last week, she was hugging her mom when I opened the door, and her face was buried, and I was like, oh, okay, like she's gonna. My thought was, okay, she's gonna be crying when she comes in. But when she pulled away, she had the biggest smile on her face, and she walked right in. She said hello to everyone. Like it took me off. It took me by surprise, honestly, just because we were still expecting it to be a transition over the next couple of weeks probably, but yeah, for it to just it was just like that.
And she was so chatty during the class.
Yeah.
I actually a couple of times had to ask her to say it in her brain because she was so chatty. And then she kept saying, I'm so excited for game time.
Mhm.
I'm so excited for game time. Oh my gosh. Zero crying.
Yeah.
Zero. So we went from week 1 where it was like an hour and a half.
Mhm.
And then week 2, I think, was like an hour and 10 minutes. And then week 3 was maybe like,
It was like 40 minutes? 30
yeah,
minutes?
something like that. And then to last week was 0,
Mhm.
0, like no sign that that had ever even happened.
Mhm.
So I do fully expect that we go backwards sometimes.
Mhm.
So when she comes in this week, we may have some crying. It's, progress is not linear. So we absolutely may go backwards a little bit, but holy cow, that was so amazing.
Yeah.
Such a better experience for her and for everybody in the group.
Mhm.
But similarly, we have called out her choices in her group. We have a lesson that was a couple weeks ago, and one of the points in that lesson is how many people does it take to affect the mood of the whole group? That's one of the things we talk about in that lesson. How many people does it take to affect the mood of the whole group? And so we called it out, right? Again, we didn't say her name.
Mhm.
We weren't staring her down, but it was when one person comes in and they're crying and they're not engaging, and they're, wanting everybody's attention. How many people does it take doing that to affect? And she was listening the whole time. She had stopped crying and was listening to this conversation the whole time. And the answer, by the way, is one. It just takes one person in a group being upset, refusing to participate, making negative comments.
Mhm.
It just takes one person for everybody else to start to feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And honestly, obviously, the more people who do it, the more uncomfortable it gets, but it just takes one. And so that happened to be part of our lesson that week. And you could tell that she was listening,
Mhm.
right? That she was taking it in. So yeah. Anything else you want to say about her?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Mhm.
So then the male student that has been, the other one that's had just a really hard time starting here, he did miss a week. So we had the first week where he never even made it past the waiting room.
Mhm.
The second week, I think he came in for game time, but not the lesson.
Yes.
And then I think the third week he was absent.
I think so.
I have no sense of time. So when he came in last week, he was absent the week prior.
Yes.
So when he came in last week, I was expecting that he might sit in the room across the hall from where we do the lessons, because that's kind of where we had been before. This student up until last week, had not come in the room for a lesson. He had come in for game time twice, I think, but he had not come in for a lesson. So we open the door and there he is, walks right on in, goes into the room where we're having the lesson and finds a chair and has a seat. Just like
As if
that. Like,
nothing,
yeah. And again, Romero and I are like doing the double take, right? Both of these kids just came in like nothing,
Mhm.
like they've been here for months. And yeah, participating in the lesson, everything was like, yeah, like it
Yeah.
was like a regular lesson.
Mhm.
So that was so awesome. But we've also talked about that, right? I think we talked about how if kids come for game time and they're just sitting on the side,
Mhm.
or they don't make a choice about joining a group, or they don't pick a game, that the other kids find someone else to spend their time with. And it's not even always intentional.
Right.
We're just all running in and picking a game and picking a group, and we want to go, right? So we're not paying attention to the kid standing off to the side.
Mhm.
We're not paying attention to the kid who hasn't picked a group yet. So there's no maliciousness to it. We're just not paying attention. We're paying attention to what we want to do, and finding other people and the things that we want to do. And so if kids get left out of game time, that's their choice. They are choosing to not join a group or pick a game or ask if they can play. And we had that conversation recently that we're all responsible for ourselves at game time. If you want to play, you got to make that choice. So these are just examples of how we explicitly, deliberately call out choices that kids make in a very black and white, direct way. But we are never disrespectful to the child. We always acknowledge that it's okay for them to feel the way that they feel. It's okay to not want to be here. It's okay to feel like you want to cry. It's okay to feel anxious about coming in the room. It's okay to feel anxious like that nobody's going to want to play with you. It's always okay to feel that way. We just have to own our choices. And helping kids understand the natural social consequences of the choices they make, because they don't know. If they knew, they wouldn't make those choices. And then once they understand, they can still make those choices. It's still completely up to them. But they don't ever choose to keep doing that.
Right.
Because they don't want those natural social consequences. So I think, in our opinion, this is probably the easiest, quickest, most powerful strategy that we have for helping kids recognize the consequences of their choices. There is absolutely no shaming. There is no punishment. There's no blaming. There's no, like, the other kids don't ever gang up on them. There's none of that. It's just talking about because all the kids can relate to. They've probably all been in a situation where they didn't want to talk to somebody and they didn't handle it very well. Right? Or they've all been in a situation where they didn't want to be somewhere and they didn't handle it very well. Or where they didn't know what to do at game time and they ended up out of the group. So even the situations that we talk about are very relevant to all of the kids. It just didn't happen. It just didn't. How does that sentence go?
I think you're right. It
Happen to happen. With them that day, right? But they could have made the same choice last week or last year. So there's so much relatability with the kids here and the choices they make and the situations that they're in, that it makes the lessons apply to everybody, right? So I'm trying to think. Yeah, so that's 4 examples right there. The 2 kids that have been really anxious to come in, the kiddo who says, like, I'm bad, or I'm having a, crummy day. This kiddo who was really awkward when someone was trying to have a conversation with her. Oh, we even talked about the kiddo who tried to take somebody else's chair, and just the conversation that comes from that, right? Yeah, so we do call it out in front of the group, but it is for the benefit of everybody in the group learning from that situation. There is never an intent to embarrass or shame anybody. And we've never had a student react that way. We've never had somebody cry. We've never had them leave the group. We've never had them get upset. We've never had them disengage. We actually see the opposite. We see that when we call these things out, that child chooses to make a different choice. We've also done it on things like, one of our lessons is about answer. So some of our kids have a reputation for being shy or anxious, and they don't answer questions when people ask them. They don't engage in conversations. That's its own set of issues, right? Because then people are much less likely to even want to talk to you the next time. So we have a couple kids that we've called out for that, right? Like if people are asking you questions and you are not answering their questions, what you probably think is happening is that you're just kind of disappearing. You're just kind of fading. But what's actually happening is everybody thinks that's super awkward. Everybody thinks it's really weird that somebody's asking you a question and you're just not answering. And we notice a big change when we call out stuff like that too. I can think of 2 of our students in particular that applies to them. And we've noticed a big change in that. That now when people say things to them, they respond. So just calling out because I think it's understanding that the kids think it has one consequence when actually it has a different one. So the student not wanting to engage in the conversation last week, she thinks it's going to make people like leave her alone or ask her what's wrong,
Mhm.
right? That's absolutely not it. It makes people leave her alone, yes, but leave her alone perpetually,
Mhm.
right? Like the next week they didn't want to talk to her again. The kids who the one who was crying thought that people were going to ask her what was wrong and pay attention to her when actually everybody just ignored her and didn't really want to play with her.
Mhm.
Um,
The student during game time, when no one wanted to play his pretend game,
uh-huh.
and so like he was like on the floor, or he was like
We
head
talked
down on
about
the
that
table.
previously.
Mhm.
What do you think he thought was going to happen when he did that?
The other students were going to come up to him and agree to play his game because he felt bad that they weren't playing his game.
And is that what happened?
Not at all.
Yeah, we've talked about that on a previous episode too. That's another great example. We talked about it in front of the whole group,
Mhm.
right? Every student that was in that room was part of that conversation because he's not the only person who's made that choice in their life,
Mhm.
right? Most of the other kids have had that experience where something was upsetting or disappointing and they chose to like sulk about it or try to get attention for it. So yeah, it's always relevant to everybody.
Mhm.
It's like a learning opportunity for everybody. And then we all just move on.
Mhm.
Every time we all just move on. And it usually doesn't even come up again
Yeah.
unless it's somebody else in a similar situation or that's new and hasn't been part of that conversation.
Mhm.
Okay. Trying to think if there's anything else that we want to add. I want to share one more thing. It's not exactly related, but it's another strategy. It goes along with just how we interact with our kids. This was weird. We had the same thing happen with two different kids in the same day. So I'll teach you guys a strategy that we teach to the kids here when the kids are going to say something that's unrelated or off topic. As you guys know, because you either have neurodivergent kids or you teach them, I'm sure that's why you're here. Our kids, a lot of times, if they say something that seems really random, they have a connection in their brain. Something that somebody else said triggered a thought chain and led them to what they say next. We just don't know what that connection is. And so to us, it seems very random, but to them, it's not. That's usually the chain of events, is it caused a thought process in their brain that we're just not privy to. So what we teach our kids to say is, I know this is off topic, but, or I know this is random, but, and then the joke is that you can say anything you want to after that. You can say, I know this is off topic, but I love butterflies, right? Like you literally can say anything as long as you preface it with that. So we have a lesson where we teach our kids this strategy and then they get to practice and be super silly with it because you really can use it for anything.
Mhm.
But once they learn that strategy, they're expected to use it, right? And so sometimes they'll even hear other kids say, well, that was random. And they'll be like, oh, I know this is off top, right?
Yeah.
So we really enforce and encourage this strategy because it's a little thing that makes a big difference. So I'm going to use it right now. That was my point in this whole thing. My whole point was to say, I know this is off topic, but what we're going to talk about next is how we handled a couple of scenarios last week. So here at Starfish, kids are allowed to bring things. We don't recommend it,
Mhm.
but our philosophy here is that we assume our kids are going to be responsible instead of assuming they're not. So for example, we don't have a cell phone policy here. Anybody can bring a phone. The expectation is that it's put away. That's it. And during the transition every hour, there's about 5 minutes where if you want to be on your phone, you totally can be. And then when the new game time starts or class starts, we put them away. As long as they can be responsible for that, they can bring their phone. Does not matter to us at all. If they're not able to be responsible in that way, then they might not be able to bring their phone again. We've only had that happen maybe twice in 7 years. The same with like, we've had a kid bring huge stuffed animals every week. Totally fine as long as it doesn't become a distraction. If it becomes a distraction, you won't be able to bring it again. But I'm going to assume that you're going to be responsible with it. Fidgets. We have kids that bring fidgets. We have kids that sometimes wear weird things for holidays or, like whatever. Totally fine to bring. We had a kid who brought like 4 books one day. We don't read here, right? So totally fine to bring them as long as they're not an issue. So last week we had 2 different kids that both brought drawing pads. And so one of them at games, he sat through the lesson. I think I had asked him, like, hey, what do you want to do with that during the lesson, is how I say it. And I don't tell him to put it away. I don't tell him he can't have it. I say, what do you want to do with that during the lesson? And then sometimes I'll give a choice. Do you want to sit on it or do you want to go put it in the waiting room? Which would you prefer? So during the lesson, he put it under his chair. Game time, he's got it out and he's drawing on it. The challenge with kids bringing things from home is it's a very convenient excuse for them to disengage from the group. So if somebody's brought a drawing pad, a book, their own game, it's a very convenient excuse for them to disengage. So that's why we don't, the expectation is that we're not bringing things from home and we're not engaging with things that distract us from being part of the group. So we go to game time and he's sitting by himself drawing on his notepad. So I just repeated it. Hey, during game time, do you want to put that in the waiting room or do you want to put it on your chair? Which would you prefer? And he said, well, I'm talking to the other kids, which he wasn't. And so I said, yeah, we don't draw at game time. So and I just repeated it. Would you prefer to put it in the waiting room or put it on your chair? And I think he ended up putting it, I don't even remember which one he did actually. No, he put it in the waiting room. He went out and put it in the waiting room. And then that was it. That was the end of it. Same time, different student comes in with a drawing pad. I'm like, what is the deal? This student has been here for years. And so he comes in with his drawing pad. Same situation. Hey, kiddo, do you want to put that in the waiting room or do you want to put it under your chair? Well, why can't I just draw? Oh yeah, the expectation. We don't draw during game time. So it's up to you, totally up to you. Do you want to put it in the waiting room? Do you want to put it on your chair? He then went to the waiting room, I assumed, to put his drawing pad down and come back. Ramiro noticed he was in the waiting room drawing.
Yep. I remember I saw him and I asked him, hey, what are you doing? Like, everyone's inside playing games.
Because you didn't know we'd had that conversation.
Right. And he answered me, oh yeah, Steph asked me to put this in the waiting room. And I was like, oh, okay, so you're going to put it down and come back in, or you're just going to stay out here? And he said, well, technically I'm putting it in here. I'm just staying out here. Like, okay. Like, all right, well, you're technically not wrong. And like, it is his choice. I did not get upset with him. I did not criticize him or tell him you better get back inside right now. Like, no, I said, okay, well, that's just kind of odd that everyone else is inside playing games and you're just choosing to be out here instead. And I just left it at that. And I went back into the group and I let Steph know that that he was out there drawing.
Because I had no idea. Like, we get pretty caught up in like the kids and what's going on. And so, like sometimes we don't notice that somebody's, like been in the bathroom for 20 minutes or, just things like that. We get caught up in the group. So I was like, oh, okay. So I went out to the waiting room and sure enough, he's sitting there drawing. And so I said, I just want to remind you that if your drawing pad becomes an issue, you won't be able to bring it back. So it's totally up to you. But if you want to bring it back again next week, because I don't care if you have it. If you want to bring it back again next week, it's got to be put away so you can come back to the group. If you choose to stay out here with it, it just means that I'll need to let mom know that it's not able to come back next week. But either way, I don't care. I don't care which one you choose. And so he tried to make it an argument. And we just don't engage, right? Because it's not an argument. It's, I don't care which one you choose. I just want to make sure that you know what the consequences of each one of your choices is. And then it's totally up to you. It does not matter to me. So Ramiro and I, like, there's not even a way to make it an argument because we don't care. Like, you just, whichever choice you want, totally fine. So he got a little frustrated with that. And he said, I said something like, I'm going to go. He said, are you going to stay here the whole time? And I said, actually, I'm going to go back to game time because that's where I much prefer to be. I said, it's pretty boring out here. And he said, good. I'm like, something like, I can't wait for you to go, or something like that. And so I just said, I've known this kid for years. So I just said, I noticed that when you start talking like that, it usually is because you're a little bit embarrassed. And then I just said, I'm going to go back to game time. I really hope that I see you there. And then I just left it, he's in the waiting room. He's a little bit older, so he's totally fine to be in the waiting room by himself. I'm not worried about him. About 15 minutes, it was a while later, probably about 15 minutes later, he saunters back into game time and he pulls right up next to me and starts having a conversation with me about something completely random, not related at all to the drawing pad, not related at all to, him telling me he was glad I was leaving. None of that, just a totally random conversation. So before the end of the day, I just said to him, when we were leaving, I said, what do you want to do about your drawing pad? And he said, oh yeah, I'll just leave it at home next week. Like, just like that, I'll just leave it at home next week. So he definitely is a kiddo that gets into power struggles, right? You can tell that just by the way that he was trying to respond. Ramiro and I just don't do that. We just don't spend our energy arguing. If you give two choices, neither of which matter to you, right? And then just let the child know the consequences of each choice, right? If you make this choice, this is probably what's going to happen. If you make this choice, this is probably what's going to happen. And then you just let them decide, and you physically remove yourself, because it's not an argument. It's not a power struggle. It's not even a discussion. It's giving them the autonomy to make their own choice. But if you have kids I'm speaking from Steph experience, stubborn brain experience, if you leave your physical body there, you're creating a power struggle. I want to do what I want to do, and I want it to seem like it was my choice. And so the longer you stand there in front of me, the less likely I am to make the choice that would have a better outcome for me, because I'm going to hold my ground. But if you leave, then it can feel like it was my choice. Okay. Another way that I really love to give two choices is with the concept of time. Would you like to do that now or in 5 minutes? And that's a really powerful one. Almost always they will say in 5 minutes, and then you just set a timer. And when the timer goes off, anytime I've used that strategy, I usually don't even have to say anything, but it gives them the time for it to feel like it was their choice. And so they're much more likely to follow through on it. Sometimes if there's things that I need to talk to a parent about, I'll say, do you want to tell mom or do you want me to? It's totally your choice. And I just let them choose. I don't care either way. Right. But it's giving them the freedom of choice. And then they can, they can decide which one they prefer. So I just really love giving kids two choices. Two makes it not overwhelming. If you just leave it open, it can be overwhelming, but just giving them two choices, and then when appropriate, letting them know the consequences of each one. Yeah, you can totally do that if you want to. I'm just a little worried that this might happen if you do, right? I had this conversation with somebody recently, if I can remember it, I can give you the specific example. A parent in our program, I think, asked, like, what do I do about this? And I was like, well, this is what I would say. You can totally do either one. I'm just a little worried that if you do this one, this is what might happen. Oh gosh, I can see it in print. Like, I can see myself responding to that in an email, but I can't remember what the situation was now. Oh, it's going to make me crazy. Okay. Anything else that you want to add while I'm going crazy trying to remember what that was?
I don't think so. Yeah.
I'm relying on you, Ramiro.
I'm trying to think.
Let me see. What was that? Yeah, I absolutely don't remember. But that's basically the gist of it, is, giving two choices, because the reality is that our kids can do anything they want to. We even talk about, when we talk about ways to respond to something, like we'll give examples of, if somebody's rude to you, what are some ways you can respond to that? You can hit them, right? That's totally a choice. Absolutely. That's a choice. What might the consequence of that be? Okay. What's another choice? You can, like say something really rude to them. Absolutely. You could say something really rude to them. What might the consequence of that be? Okay, what would be another choice? You could ignore them. Absolutely, you could ignore them. What might the consequence of that be? Okay, so we are not putting any weight on any choice over any other choice. There's no weight to it. There's no prejudice behind what the choices are. It's just, what are your choices and what are the natural consequences of those choices, and which consequence do you most prefer, right? Which consequence are you most willing to live with? So yeah, same with homework, right? Yeah, you totally don't have to do your homework. You absolutely don't have to do your homework. My concern with that would be that you might have to miss recess tomorrow. Or for older kids, my concern with that would be that you might end up having to stay after school to do it tomorrow. We had a kid tell us a few weeks ago that he has learned, he's in middle school, he used to never do homework. And he's learned that if he wants to do what he wants to do for a career, he's got to get into college. And in order to get into college, he's got to have good grades in high school. And in order to get to high school, he's got to pass 8th grade. Right. But again, that's not somebody telling him those things. That's him making those choices for himself. So whenever we make our own choices, that's the most powerful. The most powerful thing for all of us is being able to make our own choices.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to try for like 2 more seconds to see if I can remember what that scenario was. Okay, I have no idea. But anyways, y'all get the point, I'm sure. Okay. So that is our episode for today. The combination of being really black and white and blunt with our kids, but not rude or disrespectful or condescending. It is never intended to call anybody out. It is intended to be a learning moment for everybody who's in the group. So being very careful of your tone of voice, I will intentionally not look at that student while we're having this discussion. I'll look at the other kids in the group just so there's no like implied anything. So yeah, we have to be really careful that we have a neutral tone of voice, that we're not speaking in a disrespectful way. We're not saying their name. We're not calling them out in front of other people. We're just talking about the scenario that has unfolded. And every time that we do that, we see an immediate shift. Yeah, super cool. All right. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you again next time.